Good morning. I'd like to talk today about the environment, not so much the natural environment, the air and the water and the trees and so on, but the man-made environment, because we're going to be thinking about how the things that people design and make contribute to injuries and how they can be made safer so they're not as likely to be causing injury. You've heard already about passive or automatic protection. In other words, the kind of protection that automatically protects you or your children or your family without anyone even thinking about it each time someone needs to be protected and without everybody having to change their behavior. One reason that passive protection is so valuable is that the people who are at highest risk of injury, who most need some kind of protection, are the very least likely to protect themselves, the people whose behavior is hardest to change. Who are the people who most need protection? Who are the ones that are at greatest risk of injury? Give some thought to whether or not their behavior on an individual basis is easy to change. Well, think about little children. When was the last time you tried to keep a small child from going in the wrong direction? How about elderly people? They are at very high risk of injury. Have you tried to convince your grandmother she should cook differently or have her apartment arranged differently? Older people tend to like not to change. Teenagers, male teenagers in particular, and examples of what we see with some of these high-risk drivers are who is likely or unlikely to use their seatbelt. Male teenage drivers, the ones who are at highest risk of being in a crash, are the least likely to have fastened their seatbelt. In addition, people who are driving at high speed, they're more likely to be in a crash, and they are more likely to be injured when they're in a crash. Drivers who are following other vehicles too closely or running red lights. We did a study here at the School of Public Health some years ago when our students went out to measure whether drivers were wearing their shoulder belts and whether they were running red lights. And it turned out that the very same drivers who were not wearing their shoulder belt were much less likely to stop for a traffic light. Also, drivers who are driving at night when crash risks are higher, drivers who are following other vehicles too closely. It seems as though not only the people who are at high risk, but the high-risk things that they do, the high-risk situations, those drivers are the least likely to be wearing their seatbelts. The same is true of drivers who have been drinking too much. Certainly they are more likely to have crashes, and certainly they are less likely to be wearing their seatbelts. The difference between intentional injury and unintentional injury is not as great as you might think, both in terms of the environmental conditions that are involved. It's not so much what is intended when a child is playing with a gun, is what actually happens. And if we all had no guns that were not personalized in some way, so that only the owner of the gun could fire it, then children could not shoot and kill other people, as happens too often right now. Poisonings, intentional poisonings, when someone, for example, is trying to commit suicide, is very much affected by certain designs. For example, whether or not prescriptions are packaged a certain way, how many drugs are changed in any given prescription, whether a person unintentionally or intentionally would take too much of that drug is very much influenced by how they are packaged, how many are in a container, and so on. We saw some years ago what happened with cooking gas and huge differences in the number of deaths in our population over a course of several decades, from 1947 to 1979, as shown on this graph. And we went down to almost zero deaths during a period when coal gas, the kind of gas that was used in our stoves, which had been very popular, of widespread use and so on, when we changed to natural gas, which is not poisonous when it is breathed, the number of deaths from home cooking gas went down practically to zero, as you can see in this slide. This was true of both unintentional poisoning, when people literally stuck their head in the oven. If there was natural gas, it would not poison them. If they were, and those poisonings went down tremendously. Also, suicide by gas poisoning went down from about 1,200 deaths a year to less than 200 deaths a year. So regardless of intent, certain types of preventive measures can save many, many lives. We tend to divide preventive measures into event phase, the pre-event phase, and the post-event phase. If you were thinking of crashes, then you've got pre-crash, the crash phase, and the post-crash phase. If we look at other types of injuries, we can think about, in the pre-event phase, trying to put barriers around stones, and I'll show you in a minute what I'm talking about there, and the post-event phase, when people know or don't know that they should put cool water on a burn, not ice-cold water, but cool water on a burn, and not, I've been in other countries, in Sri Lanka, for example, where physicians, even emergency room physicians, did not realize that you should put cool water on a burn immediately. Some of the non-physicians thought things like killing an animal and putting its blood on the burn would help to prevent the tissues from actually being damaged. I mentioned stones and Somalia refugees for a while. Their children were being burned, as this child was, by tripping over stones when a fire had been built with just 3 stones around it. Finally, the refugees themselves and one of my former students, John Magulaid, devised a good way that they could still cook over their 3 stones, but they were unlikely to be burned. Previously, those 3 stones would have been simply sitting out in the middle of the courtyard. Now, with something around them, they were much more noticeable. Some of the things that were built, in fact, were really very, very protective. This stove, in effect, has a place where someone can sit and watch the fire, and where children are not likely to run into it because of not seeing it. And this would not have cost them anyway. We don't need to think about things that are technologically advanced in order to protect people from injury. So one of the main messages this morning is that it's a lot easier to change the environment, especially the man-made environment, than to change the way everybody behaves. People don't take risks because they want to be injured. They take risks because of some of the pressures that affect all of us. There are economic pressures. People who realize that if they don't do something quickly, they're going to lose money. The farmers who have to get their hay in before it rains. That's an example of economic pressure. Productivity pressure. Think about people cutting wood out in the forest. A study was done that showed that the people who worked by the hour and were going to be paid for 8 hours of work were much less likely to be injured than the foresters, lumbermen, who were being paid by the number of trees that they cut or the linear footage of the tree trunks that they were operating on. There are, of course, competition pressures. You only have to watch a game of football or soccer to see that the desire to win, the desire to beat your opponents, certainly contributes to the risks that a sports person may take. Peer pressure, I'll show you a slide about that in a minute. Time pressure, getting to the store before it closes, or trying to beat the traffic light before it turns. Those things can cause people to speed, to take risks, to be more likely to be in crashes. So here's an example of peer pressure, where probably one or two of these teenagers went in the water, and pretty soon a whole lot others went in. And yet that sign says, danger, scalding water, unpredictable eruptions, unstable ground, high pollution, sudden temperature changes, broken glass, arsenic in the water, all of these things, and yet look and see what those teenagers have done. And they're not going to say, oh, I don't think I'll go in, I might hit some broken glass. No, they're going to go in and have fun with the others. That's just a very vivid example of peer pressure. Time pressure, this is a very important point to remember, that the safest way of doing anything has to be the quickest and easiest way, or people are going to choose a more hazardous way. Here, if you look at the structure that was built across this highway in India so that people would not have to cross in front of cars, required a person to go up all those stairs, walk across and down, maybe carrying a bicycle, maybe carrying their groceries or their children, but it certainly was a lot easier and quicker to simply run across the street, and that's what all the people you see. You don't see anybody up on the overhead passage. Here in Sri Lanka, a bridge was designed with a separate walkway for pedestrians and bicyclists to use. Otherwise, they would have been out there mixing it in with trucks and cars and so on. But it was certainly safer and easier and even quicker for them to use the walkway on the side, and so that's what they chose. Oftentimes we don't recognize hazards, sometimes because of the way things are built and our visual cues and so on. Here in Baltimore, at the Inner Harbor, there's a rather confusing way that the bricks have been designed with white stripes across them. In some cases, as in this slide, the white stripes don't show anything. They're only there for, to make it look more interesting. On the other hand, in back of the stores, those white things that you see actually are at the edge of a 4-inch or 6-inch drop. So that if someone is looking at that structure overhead while they're walking, this is what's going to happen to them. I was standing there with my camera just taking a picture of what I thought was a hazard when I heard somebody cry out in back of me, and I turned around, and this is what had happened. A woman had walked right off of the edge and fallen. It's important to consider the people who are going to be using any sort of facility when you design it. Residential facilities are just places where, in general, elderly people live, people whose hearing, sight, reactions, and so on are much weaker poorer than they are for others. You have a whole population of people who are at very high risk of being injured, and for that reason it's especially important that you change the water temperature and a lot of other things to keep them safe. This was my mother-in-law soon after they moved into a retirement home for older people. The water there was so hot that my husband went home and got his the thermometer from his old chemistry set and brought it back to the residential facility, tested the temperature of the water. It was 180 degrees. You can poach eggs at 180 degrees, to say nothing of poaching people. Yet there is somebody who is especially likely, either at the sink or even more so in the shower, to turn the handle the wrong way, or for some reason to turn it so that the hottest water comes out. And it's very important that the hottest water be not more than 120 degrees. Here, if you look up just above the just above the stove where you see the white arrow, there is a very sharp edge at the edge of the hood. My mother-in-law had banged her head on that corner, so she took the Band-Aid off her forehead and put it on the sharp corner so that next time she wouldn't be as likely to hit it. But that could have been and should have been designed with a rounded corner, which would have been far less likely to injure her or anyone else. Here she is walking along a sidewalk in this same residential facility for the elderly. And her vision is very poor. She may not notice the tripping hazard. And if she falls, you can see she's going to land on cement. There's no handrail to hold onto. And yet here is a tripping hazard in the sidewalk. And that was painted with white paint, theoretically, to call one's attention to it. You can barely see, and she certainly could not have seen the difference between white paint and the rest of the sidewalk. Older people are much more likely to kind of shuffle along without picking up their feet. So that's a tripping hazard that certainly should have been obliterated long before she was walking along. What about eyesight when you're trying to get the right container of eye drops? Can you tell which of these two containers is eye drops and which one has super glue? When this kind of glue was first sold, it was in the kind of container at the right-hand side, and emergency rooms were seeing people who literally had glued their eyelids shut. And yet designers had not considered the fact that the containers on the left, people were so used to looking at those that it was very easy to grab the kind of container on the right and think that you were going to be putting eye drops in. It would have been a very simple matter to have done a little research on what types of containers were used for what types of products. I've included this slide of a fatal house fire to call attention to the fact that some children, depending upon where they live, are at very high risk of dying in house fires. In Maryland, the poor housing that was available in some of the row houses was housing in which there were people living who were much more likely to be smoking and drinking. There were characteristics of the house that might keep them from getting out of the house. They were a population who might not be well trained in how to get safely out of the house. So both the people involved, the conditions in which they lived, and whether it was a house or whether it was farmers in rural areas, the children had much higher death rates in house fires than did children in other settings. we reviewed the house fire deaths that had occurred in Baltimore. What we found was that not only were the majority of the fires ignited by smoldering cigarettes, but half of those people in cigarette-ignited fires were not the smokers of the cigarettes. I emphasize this point because that very fact that the people dying were not the smokers of the cigarettes was used when we got the first state legislation that required that cigarettes should not smolder and start fires. Prior to that time, I think people were saying, oh, well, they were just drunk, or oh, well, this, that, or the other thing. They shouldn't have been smoking. They shouldn't have left their cigarettes. Well, when the legislators realized that a lot of the people, 39% of the people, could not have been the smokers of the cigarettes. They were little kids. They were people in the next apartment or the upstairs apartment. They certainly had not been smoking the cigarettes that had ended up causing their death. That information was very important in helping us to get the legislation that we needed. Here's a diagram of a fire-safe cigarette. If it's just left at the edge of an ashtray, the little bands of what we call speed bumps, little bands of paper that could not burn would put out the fire. In the upper cigarette, the cigarette burned only for a moment before getting down to one of those bands. In the lower cigarette, that burned quite a ways down, long enough to have caught the upholstery or the bedding or whatever on fire. Here's another example of what the environment can lead to. There's a sign up there that says, danger, keep away. In the first place, you can't see it when you're standing on the ground. In the second place, the children whom you would like to influence may not be able to reach. In the third place, in the same environment, here is climbing equipment for children, especially for children. So it's not surprising that some of the children, when they'd finished mastering the swing set there, would go over and try to climb the more challenging standards for the high tension wires, which have been instrumental in leading to the death of young children. Not just the height from which they might fall, but the electrical current itself. Speaking of height, look at this sliding board. That's Steve Terrett's little boy up there. We send our kids up to heights, up things that are so high that if that were a window washer, he could not have been that high without wearing a safety belt, some kind of safety equipment, because of the regulations that if you're working that high up, you have to have something. But we send our kids up and say, oh, be careful, Johnny, that's pretty steep up there. Don't push and shove and look out, and we think they're going to be okay. Luckily, we've come to our senses in many cases and designed playgrounds where children can't fall for a great distance. This sliding board was built into a hillside so that if a kid toppled off the top of it, he wouldn't fall more than a foot or two rather than 10 or 15 or 20 feet. And this sliding board has protection against kids rolling off the side. What's more, the surface on the ground of wood chips is much more forgiving if a child falls. This is an alternative to a child's walker. Many of the falls that were seen in emergency rooms were from children walking right down a staircase. And the solution, or one solution, was to design walkers that would not go through the railings at the top of a staircase. There were other solutions, but the main thing about this is it's passive protection. The mother doesn't have to be looking at the child every minute to see where he's walking to, because he's not going anywhere. He's going to have fun. He's going to be moving his legs, thinking that he's walking probably, but it's a much safer design. Foods, you may not think of foods as being part of the environment, but they certainly are, and it's a man-made, in many instances, it's a man-made environment. We studied the foods that had been reported to cause choking death in children less than 5 years old. And in the study period of those foods, 17 of them were hot dogs or sausages. 9 were peanuts or nuts. 8 grapes, 6 carrots, 4 beans, 4 hard candies. What do those foods have in common? Well, I think the most noticeable thing is that they're usually round. And if you look at the characteristics of the foods, then you can see why those foods might be likely to choke a child. Hot dogs in particular, a cross-section of a hot dog makes a perfect plug for a child's airway. And the most dangerous foods are those that are smooth, that are tough enough that they're not going to fall apart, that are small, not too small, not too large, but just the size that's going to plug up a child's airway, that are round and pliable, cohesive, meaning that they don't fall apart. A bite of hot dog is a perfect plug for a child's airway. And we have to, ideally, we should be designing hot dogs, which after all are man-made. They could be designed in such a way that when a child bit through them, it would fall apart into something that would not choke them. All you'd need to do would be to put a thin layer of the kind of material that's used for casing hot dogs. You put a thin layer of that down the middle of the hot dog, and it's not going to form a plug when a child bites off a bite. Here are pacifiers. A big difference in the size of those pacifiers. When one of the Maryland medical examiners, Cherry Michaelis, was autopsying a child who had choked to death on a pacifier the size of the white one there, he realized that that was a whole lot smaller than the pacifiers that his children used. In fact, he hadn't often seen a pacifier that small. It turned out that they were imported pacifiers that were much smaller than the usual American-made pacifiers. And he and others were instrumental in getting the Maryland Product Safety Commission to ban small pacifiers. And we tried hard to get the National Product Safety Commission to do the same with a national regulation. And they didn't, as long as they thought it was a Maryland problem. But as soon as a child choked to death in New Jersey on a very small pacifier, that moved them into action, and they made a standard that a small pacifier would not be able to pass. This child might just get wet, or if the water is scalding, the child might be scalded to death. It happened to the child of a friend of mine. Fell into a bathtub where he'd run some water to sail his boats, and while his mother was answering the door, he tried to turn the water off and fell in, and unfortunately, very sadly, was scalded to death. That can be changed by making sure that hot water heaters cannot discharge water that's more than 120 degrees. Now, if this slide is designed to show the relationship between what kind of protection a child is going to get and how much effort is going to be made in order to keep the child from being scalded. If you're watching a young child, you're watching them all the time, and it's minimum protection in terms of whether or not they're going to, say, fall into a bathtub. If, rather than watching a child all the time, if you adjust the valve on your hot water heater, you can make sure that the water isn't discharged at extremely high temperatures. But even adjusting the valve on the heater is not really passive protection. Ideally, if the heaters are designed in such a way that they simply cannot let water through if it's more than 150 degrees, that's where you get your maximum protection and the minimum amount of effort. This child is in a device. The first time I saw it advertised, I thought, oh, Lord, children are going to drown in that. They're going to fall out. And sure enough, very soon, children who were in the bathtub where their mothers had thought they would be safe, and at times the parent had left the bathroom just for a minute, and that's all it takes. Children were drowning. What the Consumer Product Safety Commission did, unfortunately, was simply to have a poster showing a picture of what you were not supposed to do and a picture of a mother watching her child. That is not the way to keep children from drowning. Only by making sure that that type of little bathtub chair wasn't even available, wasn't even produced and sold, could those deaths be prevented. So who's making these decisions, some of which are lousy decisions that determine whether or not a child or an older person or someone is injured? Well, the manufacturers, the designers of equipment, of cars, roads, food, and so on. Those are decisions that they are making or the manufacturers are making. The people who pass regulations, the legislators, regulators, their decisions. It's not just the decision of every individual. You don't want people to have to make that kind of decision all the time. Without being overly protective, you want to provide an environment that, while it allows children to explore, have fun, and so on, is not going to kill them. Here's what happened in Australia when they put up fencing, when they required fencing around swimming pools. One Australian city, in Brisbane, they required fencing, and in those homes there were only 1/9 as many drownings per 100,000 children as there were in Canberra. Canberra had only slightly more pools per 100 houses, but Canberra had 9 times as many drownings per 100,000 children because it had fences that would surround the pool. It was required to fence the pools. And that's what we're coming to more and more here in the United States. Let me show you the environment of the inside of a car, how that makes a difference. In compact pickup trucks, shown here on the left, the number of serious head injuries in child passengers in that type of vehicle when it was in a crash, the number was about 6 times what it was in the other types of vehicles, whether it was a regular type of pickup truck, shown here in darker green, or cars, passenger vehicles, SUVs. It was that particular type of compact pickup truck that apparently lent itself to serious head injury in children. Flora Winston, a doctor in Philadelphia, at the Philadelphia hospital, found that children in the back seat of pickup trucks had much higher rates of head injury than the children in the front seat. Now, normally you'd expect children in the back seat of a car in a crash to have a lower risk of injury. That's why we encourage people in various ways. We encourage people to put their children in the back seat. But in these small pickup trucks, the kids had to be sitting sideways. Their head could hit the headrest of the person in front of them, and they had much higher risk of head injury than children in the back seat of other types of vehicles. Dr. Winston and her colleagues showed their results to the federal regulators and to the manufacturers, and rather than waiting months or even a year or more before their results could be published, they took these results to the people who could make a difference, who could require that that type of situation couldn't exist. And very soon, the manufacturers were not even manufacturing that type of very hazardous small pickup truck. I'm going to show you now a movie that was made by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety called Booby Trap, and it was designed to show us how much difference the way the sides of the roads are designed, how much difference that can make in whether a crash occurs and in whether that crash injures or kills the person in the crash.
A modern highway built to strict safety standards with all the latest life-saving technology. Or is it? Tens of thousands of new expressway miles like this one have been opened to traffic in recent years. Interstate expressways, turnpikes, state highways. Just how safe are these so-called modern roads? And how safe are millions of miles of older highways? The answer is in your morning newspaper, in the stories and photos of adults and children destroyed or maimed for life in crashes into any one of the host of hazards that routinely, needlessly, line the sides of our highways. I'm Ben Kelly for the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. I want you to join me for an uncommon look at an all too common part of your environment, the mess of booby traps that has turned the sides of our roads into instruments of death and injury for thousands of car occupants each year. You and I see these roadsides every day, but not the way we'll see them for the next few minutes. The bridge piers and signposts, the trees and rocks. You need stray from the road only a foot or so, for only a moment or so, to risk running into any one of a number of lethal hazards. Of course, if cars never left the road, there'd be no problem. But they do, all the time, for all sorts of reasons. What about people in cars that veer off the road because the road itself was poorly designed? Skidding in wet weather, for instance. These films were shot in everyday traffic near Washington, D.C. by a congressional staff team investigating highway design that actually encourages skidding. Commonplace skids like these, whether caused by roads or drivers, can bring cruel and unusual punishment to occupants when their vehicles are hurtled into roadside death traps even before their drivers have a chance to regain control. Have you ever been thrown into confusion along an unfamiliar expressway by misleading signs or a poorly placed exit ramp? These are interstate highway segments where the same congressional investigators gathered filmed evidence of erratic driving caused by poor signs and poor ramp design. A moment before they came into camera range, the drivers of these cars and trucks were confronted by confusing signs that caused their harrowing near misses. This kind of forced indecision can also take cars and their occupants right into one of the many unforgiving obstacles that line the roadsides. How about the mother whose car veered off the road when she turned to look at her crying child in the back seat? Or the man who lost control of his car when his faulty engine mounts broke or a tire blew? And what about the people forced off the road by drunks or incompetent drivers? Do they really deserve death or a lifetime in a wheelchair? Some public health people are starting to recognize the roadside booby trap menace for what it really is, a widespread environmental crisis. and they're aggressively seeking and promoting effective ways to combat it. One of these is Susan P. Baker. As a member of the faculty of the Johns Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health, working in the office of the Chief Medical Examiner of the state of Maryland, she's long been concerned by this problem.
Highway injuries are the same kind of public health problem that polio or impure water or anything else is, except that they're bigger than most public health problems. If we need pure water for people to drink, we don't depend upon the housewife to boil her own water. We purify the water for a whole community because this is the only way of being sure that that community is going to be safe. Why then don't we remove the hazards from the sides of the roads instead of trying to educate each person not to hit those poles? Because we can't educate the people not to hit them. What are they going to do when their car loses a wheel or when some drunk comes and sideswipes them? Think of in terms of some educational program in which they learn they should avoid poles along the sides of the highways. When you see these kids and these older folks who come in from the highways, who end up in the city morgue, you're looking at perhaps 2 kids who were killed when their car hit a tree that had been planted there. You're looking at folks whose car was split by the end of a guardrail that wasn't buried. You may see a driver whose brakes failed when he was going downhill into a dead-end intersection and there was a gas and electric pole right in the middle of his path, and he got killed. But in all the thousands of cases we've had in the morgue, I have yet to see or hear of any case where a person was killed simply because his car went out of control and came to rest on a bare shoulder.
Of course, most roadsides are far from bare. Driving along today's highways, you literally run a gauntlet of hazards that have been left there or placed there by design. Exposed concrete bridge piers and bridge railings, steep embankments, ditches and drop-offs, rigid steel signposts, unyielding light poles, telephone and utility poles, the spear-like ends of guardrails. Look familiar? It should, because it's simply a replica of the environment we drive through and take for granted every day. In fact, it's a replica of this busy interchange on a major urban expressway. Right here, we're surrounded by the death traps we just saw on the model. The concrete bridge pier, the embankment. How'd you like to hit these rocks at 60 miles an hour? The ditches and drop-off, the rigid steel signpost, the unyielding light pole, anchored in concrete, the telephone pole, as usual, just inches off the pavement. The guardrail, with an end like this, it can spear right through your car and you if you stray only a few feet off the road. If your car misses this exit here, it may end up in this gore area here, demolished by one of these signposts. Here in this gore area, just across the highway, there's a signpost and a snub-nosed guardrail. Either design could destroy your car and you. Look around the roads you travel. You'll see these booby traps and others as well. Stray boulders at the road's edge or in the median. Jagged rock cuts waiting to snag your car, like this one, where one person has already been killed. Decorative rock walls, so popular on parkways. Trees left or planted right beside the road. Storm sewers and culverts. We've taken these menaces for granted for such a long time. Dr. William Haddon Jr. is president of the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety.
These traps along the side of the road are one of the many everyday modern man-made environmental messes that are damaging people. They damage people in ways that in the final result are just as serious as the combustion products that go into the lungs, whether from smoking or from somebody's smokestack, or the the industrial chemicals that are also man-made and allowed to be present or even put in the environment. It's just a tragedy that people don't yet understand this enough to bring to bear the governmental and private, the marketplace pressures to stop this needless environmental contamination with hazards very regularly spaced where they do this kind of damage to people.
Are there ways to avoid contaminating the sides of new highways? And what about decontaminating the millions of miles of roads whose sides already are infested with booby traps? The technological answers have been available for years. They're economical, easy to implement, easy to maintain. And most important, they prevent damage to people. Take rigid light poles and signposts, which are common roadside killers. They wouldn't be if they were set back a safe distance from the side of the pavement or placed on the facing of bridge overpasses. For those situations where poles or posts have to be located near the edge of the road, breakaway designs that don't kill or maim have been well known for years. Breakaway poles, such as the ones being tested here, are starting to be used in some states. During 1 year, breakaway poles installed along selected sections of interstate highway in Louisiana were hit 16 times at more than 60 miles an hour. No one was killed. Yet most of the light poles and signposts you see along the highway are not built to break away like this in a crash. They're built to stand fast, and they kill. Research is also finding ways to modify the millions of unyielding telephone and utility poles already planted along the edges of streets and highways, so that they'll give when they're hit, as in this simulated 20-mile-an-hour crash. What about guardrail? Does it always really protect you? Not if it's guardrail that doesn't need to be there. When guardrail separates you from a clear roadside recovery area, it's an obstacle, not a protector. A guardrail is justified only when it keeps your car from hitting a worse hazard. Incidentally, take a look at this. A car hitting the guardrail here might well be guided into the bridge railing here. Now, had the guardrail been brought forward and fastened to the side of the bridge, there'd be far less danger that your car would come to a destructive stop, pocketed between bridge and guardrail. This same sort of design, hostile to life and limb, is commonplace also on bridge abutments and support pillars. Where you have to use guardrail, it's important that it do its job. It should not bounce you back across traffic like this. It should slow your car to a safe stop. Guardrail needn't let vehicles crash through into greater hazards, even heavier vehicles like buses and trucks. Guardrail like this protectively absorbs the energy of crashes by cushioning the vehicle when it's hit. In other, tighter places, alongside a bridge, for instance, or at a rock cut, or in a narrow median strip, this kind of contoured concrete barrier does an impressive job of deflecting the car away from the hazard and back along the road. British researchers are testing what they call the dragon curb, sections of tubing that hold a straying car on course on the shoulder of the road and keep it out of a crash. The end of the guardrail is itself a death trap if it isn't humanely designed. Instead of being aimed at you like a spear, it can help slow a crashing vehicle to a safe stop if it is properly flared and anchored. If your car misses the exit, the gore area could offer you a chance of recovery if it's free of booby traps. This sign, which we saw out on the highway a few moments ago, could have been made to break away in a crash. If the gore area can't be cleared of all hazards, bridge railings, for instance, or toll booths, easy-to-install cushioning systems are available to slow crashing vehicles to a gentle stop so their human contents won't be destroyed. Carefully arranged systems of empty oil drums, for instance. This is a test crash, and this is a real crash filmed automatically on a Texas highway at moment of impact. The driver was able to drive away from the high-speed crash that otherwise could have killed him. Canisters of sand can also do the job. Installations like this have been crashed into scores of times at speeds up to 75 miles an hour without a single known fatality. This system uses cells filled with water to slow your car. Another readily available system of cells is made of a dry, crushable substance. Crash cushions like these are already in use on the Golden Gate Bridge, the New York State Thruway, and other urban and rural roads, where they're saving lives simply by providing the few needed seconds and the few needed feet of energy-absorbing material to slow the crashing vehicle in a way that dissipates the crash forces so that they don't seriously damage the occupants. This is Interstate 95 between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. One of the newest stretches of interstate highway open to traffic. Its shoulders are clear of hazards. Its signs are set away from the edge of the road, sometimes on bridge overpasses. Its lights and other fixtures that must be near the edge of the road are on breakaway supports. Its bridge piers are set far back from the traveled right-of-way. The Federal Highway Administration says that you can stray off a road like this one at speeds up to 50 miles an hour without serious damage. But a federal highway official has warned that if you stray off most other streets or roads at speeds of more than just 12 miles an hour, you're all too likely to crash into a needless hazard along the edge with serious damage.
You know, one of the worst examples we know of is closest to the Washington locations where the decisions are made that leave these things along our roads and that are killing so many people. Right over by the National Airport, which is a government-owned facility under total government control. You don't need any permission to make changes. We have streams of cars coming and going on the access road. And right next to the road, about every 100 feet or so, are great big solid barrels of concrete. And right out of the middle of them comes a pole. And any car that strays off of the side of that, for whatever reason, is going to get decelerated so rapidly that the people inside are going to be badly mutilated or killed. And yet, about 1,000 feet away, we have one of the busiest airports in the country with runways along which we would not put such structures to kill and maim and destroy the vehicles, in that case, aircraft hitting them. And yet the landing speeds are quite similar in many cases and on many parts of the runway. We have sense enough to do this for airports. When are we going to have sense enough to stop killing people along the sides of our roads by putting these booby traps there that result in the same kind of damage as if the plane crashed into a pole right off the edge of the runway? It's essential that people understand this and bring the pressure to bear to get these messes cleaned up, because they were put there by man, they can be taken away by man, and we can have a lot less blood all over our vehicles on the highways and along them also.